On the 14th of March 1918, the Board of Deere and Company met in Moline, Illinois, and voted unanimously to spend $2,350,000. That figure is the one recorded in Deere's own archive. It is a very large amount of money for the time, and it did not buy a patent or a design or an idea. It bought a factory in Waterloo, Iowa, the buildings, the machinery, the men who worked in them, and one product: a two-cylinder kerosene tractor with a name that sounds like a nickname, because that is what it had been: the Waterloo Boy. That purchase is the reason there is such a thing as a John Deere tractor. Everything green with a hood on it, everywhere in the world, for the next 108 years, traces back to a board resolution taken overnight in Moline, and a plant in eastern Iowa that Deere did not build and did not design. 300 miles to the north, in St. Paul, Minnesota, a 68-year-old man was working for a company that made blowers and ventilating equipment. He had built the first machine that company in Waterloo ever tried to sell. He had been its first president. His name was on the incorporation papers, and the village he grew up in was named after his family, and the machine he put together in a blacksmith shop in the winter of 1892 is the reason anyone in Waterloo was building tractors at all. He received nothing from the sale, not a share, not a royalty, not a mention. He had been out of the company for 23 years by then, and he had left it the way a lot of men leave the thing they started, quietly, with his own money gone, because the people financing him wanted to build something else. His name was John Froelich, and the story of how he lost the company that became John Deere is not a story about a swindle. That is what makes it worth 20 minutes of your time. Nobody stole anything from him. There is no villain in it. He was pushed out for being right at the wrong moment, which is a far more common way to lose everything, and a far harder one to see coming. To understand what he built, and why it mattered enough that a company would pay $2.33 million for the factory it eventually came out of, you have to understand what threshing grain in 1892 actually involved. It involved steam, and it involved fire. In the 1890s, a farmer on the northern plains did not own the machine that threshed his crop. He could not afford it, and would not have used it for more than a fortnight a year if he had. What he did instead was wait for a threshing ring, a crew that traveled with a steam traction engine, a separator, a water wagon, a coal wagon, and enough men to feed the whole operation from dawn until the light went. John Froelich ran one of those crews. Every autumn, he took a team of men and a J.I. Case threshing machine by rail out to Langford, in what was then Dakota Territory and by then South Dakota, and threshed for the farmers up there through the season. He had a steam engine to power it, and he hated it. Understand what he was actually dealing with, because the reasons are specific, and every one of them is a cost. A steam traction engine had to be fired long before it did any work. 3 hours, on a cold morning, from cold iron to working pressure. That is 3 hours of a 16-man crew standing in a field being paid to wait. It had to be fed coal, which had to be hauled to a treeless prairie by wagon, and in some seasons could not be got at any price. It had to be fed water, and the water on the alkali flats of the Dakotas foamed in the boiler, which meant it had to be hauled in as well, or the engine would prime and lose its water and stop, and it threw sparks. That is the part that mattered most. A steam engine burning coal in a field of dry stubble, in a prairie wind, standing beside a stack of threshed straw and a season's worth of a family's income, is a fire waiting for a gust. Every man who ran one had either burned a field or watched somebody else burn one. So there was the problem, and everybody in the business could recite it. The machine that did the work was heavy, slow to start, expensive to feed, dependent on two supplies that had to be hauled across open country and permanently one spark away from destroying the crop it had been hired to save. What nobody had done was build the alternative and make it survive an entire season of real work. John Froelich was born on the 24th of November, 1849, in Giard, in Clayton County, in the northeast corner of Iowa. His father, Henry, had come from Kurhessen, in what is now the German state of Hesse. The family did well enough that the village they settled in was eventually named Froelich after them, which is a fact I want you to keep hold of, because that village is now the only place on the map that carries his name at all. He ran a grain elevator and a feed mill. He ran the threshing crew, and he had, by every account of him, the particular kind of mind that cannot leave a working machine alone. That mind produced some strange things over his life. He built a mechanical corn picker and took it out for testing and burned down the cornfield, which ended that line of inquiry. He built a washing machine. He built a dishwasher and a dryer for the dishes, decades before either was a product anybody could buy. He worked on ventilating and air cooling equipment late in life. 14 patents in total, spread across farm machinery, engines, and household appliances that would not become normal until his grandchildren were adults. But the one that mattered came out of a well-drilling rig. Around 1888, Froelich bought a gasoline engine and mounted it on a well-drilling outfit, and what he learned from that is the whole hinge of this story. A gasoline engine did not need 3 hours to start. It did not need coal hauled 200 miles. It did not need clean water. It did not throw sparks into stubble. What it did need was to be made to move. A gasoline engine in 1892 was a stationary object. It sat where you bolted it, turned a belt, and stayed there. If you wanted it in the next field, a team of horses dragged it. And that is the problem Froelich took into a blacksmith shop in the winter of 1892. He worked with a blacksmith named Will Mann. The two of them started with what could be bought: a single-cylinder gasoline engine from the Van Dusen Company of Cincinnati, a running gear, the frame and wheels, from a Robinson steam engine, because a chassis built to carry a boiler across a wheat field was already strong enough for anything they were going to put on it. Between those two purchased pieces went the part that was genuinely Froelich's, his own gearing, a transmission arrangement that took the rotation of that single cylinder and delivered it to the wheels and, this is the whole invention, could deliver it in both directions. The finished machine was a strange object even by the standards of the time, something in the region of 10,000 pounds, a tall vertical engine standing up above the frame, large flywheels, hand wheels to steer and to control it, 16 horsepower, which in 1892 was a real figure and not a small one. And it started on the difficult days by putting a rifle cartridge into the cylinder and firing it to turn the engine over, which tells you everything about how far from finished the technology was, and how determined these two men were to get it running anyway. Froelich stood on a small wooden platform at the back with his hands on a steering wheel and put it into gear, and it moved forward across the yard. Then he moved a lever, and it moved backwards. That is the moment, not the forward motion. Steam engines had been driving themselves around fields for years. It is the reverse gear that makes this machine the ancestor of every tractor built since. And if you have never worked with the equipment, it is easy to miss why. A threshing rig has to be positioned exactly. The engine sits at one end of a long drive belt, with the separator at the other, and the belt has to be tight and true, or it comes off under load and takes somebody's arm with it. Positioning a machine that only goes forwards means circling it, or hitching horses to it, or shoving it with bars, every single time. Then think about the end of a field. A machine that cannot back up cannot get out of a corner it has driven into. It cannot be reversed away from a stack. It cannot correct a bad approach without turning the whole rig around. Forward and reverse under its own power, controlled by a man standing on the machine, is the difference between an engine that happens to be able to move and a machine that can be worked. That is the line Froelich crossed in a blacksmith's yard in a village of a few dozen people. And then he did the thing that separates him from every other man who built an interesting prototype in the 1890s. He took it to work. That autumn, the machine went by rail out to Langford, South Dakota, along with a new J.I. Case threshing machine and the cooking and sleeping wagons that a threshing crew lived out of. And it ran the season. The number you will see everywhere is 72,000 bushels of grain in 52 days. It is on the museum plaques and in the reference books, and it has been repeated for a century. I want to be straight with you about that number, because this channel is not in the business of repeating figures without looking at them. Deere & Company's own historian, working from the surviving records rather than from the retellings, puts it lower, somewhere over 62,000 bushels across about 50 days. Take the lower figure. It does not weaken the story by a single degree. Either way, a machine that had existed for a matter of weeks went out onto the open prairie, was belted to a separator, and threshed better than 1,000 bushels of wheat a day for the better part of 2 months, in dust, in heat, in wind, hundreds of miles from the shop that built it, and from any man who understood how it worked, except the two who had made it. It did not break down in a way that stopped the season. It did not set the field on fire, and in the following year, Froelich was able to show that it ran the operation at roughly half the cost of the steam engine it replaced. He had the proof. He had the crew, the customers, and a season's worth of receipts. What he did not have was a factory, and that is where the story turns. He shipped the machine to Waterloo, Iowa, and showed it to businessmen there. Waterloo had what a village of 40 people did not: railroads in 4 directions, a labor force, and men with capital. They looked at it and formed a company around it immediately. On the 10th of January, 1893, the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company was incorporated, capitalized at $50,000. John Froelich was made president. The product was to be the Froelich tractor, although nobody used that word yet. The plan for the first year, as it was reported, was 50 machines. They built 4. 2 of those 4 were sold. Both were brought back by the men who bought them. Now, why? Because the failure is not the part people usually explain, and it is the only part that actually teaches you anything. It was not that the concept was wrong. The concept was so right that the entire 20th century of agriculture is built on it, and we are going to get to the numbers on that. It failed for the reasons that kill nearly every product that is 10 years early. The machine was hard to start. A rifle cartridge in the cylinder is a workaround, not a feature, and ignition and carburation in 1893 were genuinely unsolved problems, being fought over by every engine builder in the country at once. It had no support behind it. When a steam traction engine broke on a Dakota farm in 1893, there was a man within a day's travel who had worked on steam his whole life, and a supply of parts, and a shared body of knowledge going back 50 years. When a Froelich tractor broke, the number of people on Earth who could fix it was about 2, and they were both in Iowa. The buyers had no way to learn it. A farmer who had run steam since he was a boy knew the sounds a boiler makes. He did not know what a gasoline engine was supposed to sound like, and neither did his neighbor or the local blacksmith. And then the economy took the decision out of everyone's hands. 1893 was the year of one of the worst financial panics in American history. Banks failed across the country, railroads went into receivership, and farm credit dried up completely. A company in its first year, selling an unproven machine to farmers who were watching their land values collapse, is not a company with a problem. It is a company with an ending. So the board did the sensible thing, and the sensible thing finished John Froelich. They needed revenue, and there was one product the company could sell that year: stationary gasoline engines, not tractors, engines that sat still and turned a belt in a shop or a mill. The first one went into the press room of the Waterloo Courier newspaper in February of 1894, and it worked, and people bought them. Stationary engines paid the wages. Tractors did not. Every dollar and every hour that went into engines was a dollar and an hour that did not go into the machine Froelich had built. And he had put his own money into the company as well as his machine, money that went the way most first-round money went in 1893. In 1895, the business was reorganized. It was bought by a man named John W. Miller, recapitalized, and renamed. It was no longer the Waterloo Gasoline Traction Engine Company. The word traction came out of the name, and from that point, it was the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, a name that told you exactly what the new owners intended to build. Froelich withdrew. He was not fired in a dramatic scene. He was not sued or forced out by a rival or betrayed by a partner in the way these stories usually go. He was an inventor who wanted to build tractors, sitting in a company that had decided, for perfectly defensible commercial reasons, that it was in the stationary engine business. His equity was gone, his investment was gone, and the machine stayed in Waterloo because it belonged to the company, not to him. He was 45 years old. Here is what happened in Waterloo without him. The company sold stationary engines and got good at it. It grew and it hired engineers, and in time it went back to the problem that had ruined its founder, with better ignition, better carburation, better metallurgy, and, crucially, a generation of farmers who had now seen internal combustion working in their own towns. The tractor work restarted around 1911. It went nowhere for 2 years. Then, in 1913, they built 20 of a machine they called the Waterloo Boy, which was the name they had been putting on their small stationary engines. In 1914 came the Model R. Single-speed forward, 2-cylinder, running on kerosene, which was cheaper than gasoline and available in every hamlet in America. 5,240 pounds, $985. First-year sales, 118 machines. Then the Model N, with 2 forward speeds, at $1,150. And then the war. Farm prices rose, men left the land for the army, and the demand for mechanical power on American farms went vertical. Waterloo Boy production in 1917 was 4,007 tractors. Some went to Britain under a different name and different paint, sold as the Overtime because the Waterloo Boy name meant nothing to an English farmer. 300 miles away in Moline, Deere & Company was watching this with a very particular kind of anxiety. Deere sold a full line of implements, plows, planters, cultivators, everything you might pull. It had nothing to pull them with. It had tried. It had a tractor of its own design, and it was expensive, and it was not selling in numbers. And every year that went by with Ford's Fordson and IHC's machines and the Waterloo Boy in farmers' yards was a year in which the man who bought the tractor started buying the implements from whoever sold him the tractor. Deere ran field tests. The Waterloo Boy performed best. Negotiations began in January of 1918. On the 13th of March, the board sat, in the way boards do when a decision is too large to postpone, and on the 14th of March 1918, it voted. $2,350,000. Plant, machinery, employees, product line, all of it. You will see slightly different figures quoted for that sale, depending on which parts of the payment structure a given account includes. What is not in dispute is what Deere got for it. It got a working tractor with a national reputation, and a factory in Waterloo full of people who already knew how to build it. The Waterloo Boy stayed in production under Deere until 1925. By then the Model D had arrived, in green and yellow paint, and the plant that Froelic's investors had incorporated in 1893 was renamed the John Deere Tractor Company. The two-cylinder engine layout the Waterloo men had settled on stayed in John Deere tractors until 1960. Waterloo, Iowa, became one of the largest tractor manufacturing towns on Earth, and still is. Deere & Company reported worldwide sales and revenues of about $45.7 billion in its 2025 financial year, and employs somewhere near 73,000 people. That is what the 2.35 million bought, and John Froelich, in 1918, was in St. Paul. Now here is where I have to correct the version of this story that circulates most, because it is told wrong, in a way that is meant to be kind to him and actually makes him smaller than he was. You will hear that he died penniless and forgotten. The second half is closer to true than the first. What the record actually shows is a man who kept working and kept inventing for another 38 years. He left Iowa, spent time in Marshalltown and Dubuque, and ended up in St. Paul. By 1910, he was vice president of a manufacturing company that carried his own name, Henderson Froelich. A year later, he was working as a machinist in somebody else's shop, which tells you that one did not last. He worked for the Hackney Manufacturing Company, makers of farm implements, listed as a draftsman, and while he was there, he patented a powered lift for a gang plow that raised and dropped each gang in turn, so that the ends of the furrows came out even. That is not the patent of a broken man. That is somebody still looking at a field and seeing a problem in it. By 1920, he was with a firm making blowers and air handling equipment. His last position was president of a construction and investment company in St. Paul, and by the accounts of his final years, he did accumulate some money there. He also had a washing machine of his own design on the market for a while, sold as the Froelich Neo-style. So, not destitute, not a tragic ruin. A restless, capable, moderately successful engineer and businessman who spent the second half of his life in cities working for other people's companies, while the machine he had built in a blacksmith shop turned into the largest agricultural equipment industry in the world without him. John Froelich died in St. Paul on the 24th of May, 1933, at the age of 83, 15 years after the sale. He lived long enough to watch it happen and to read about it. There is one more thing that has to be dealt with honestly, and it is the claim on the plaque. Was this the first tractor? The careful answer is that first depends entirely on the sentence you put after it, and the people who make the biggest claims for Froelich usually leave that sentence off. Gasoline engines had been put onto wheels before 1892. The Charter Gas Engine Company of Sterling, Illinois, had mounted its engines on steam traction running gear a few years earlier and built a handful of machines that went out to farms. Others tried similar things in the same decade, in America and in Britain, and some of them worked after a fashion. What is defensible about Froelich's claim is narrower and, to my mind, more interesting. His was the first gasoline traction machine that could be driven forward and backward under the control of its operator, and that then went out and completed an entire commercial threshing season on real crops for paying customers. Not a demonstration, not a run around a yard for a photographer, a season. That is the standard the agricultural historians have generally applied, and it is why one of them, writing a formal survey of tractor development decades later, called Froelich's machine probably the first gasoline tractor on record that was an operating success. Note the hedging in that sentence. It is doing a lot of work, and it is honest work. There is also this. Nobody in 1892 called it a tractor, because the word was not in use for these machines yet. They were gasoline traction engines. The short form we all use now was pushed into the language around 1906 by a sales manager at the Hart Power Company in Charles City, Iowa, who wanted something that fitted in an advertisement. So the man who arguably built the first one never once, in 1892, used the word. The village of Froelich, Iowa, did not forget him, and it is very nearly the only place that did not. In 1939, 6 years after his death, the town put up a memorial with a plaque on it and held a ceremony. His son Clarence spoke. 2,000 people came, which for a village of that size means every farm for 30 miles emptied out for the afternoon. In 1991, he was inducted into the Iowa Inventors Hall of Fame, 99 years after he built the machine. The site where the tractor was assembled is now a museum, built around the general store that his youngest brother put up in 1891. There is a full-scale replica of the 1892 machine in Waterloo, in the John Deere Museum there, in the town that his company's remains turned into a tractor capital. The original does not exist. It was worked and then it was scrapped, the way machines were. So what do you take from this one? The version I would resist is the sentimental one, where a good man is robbed by financiers and dies broken. That did not happen, and Froelich would probably have been irritated by it. What actually happened is harder and more useful. He solved the problem correctly, first, and in public, and with receipts. And solving a problem correctly turns out to be a fraction of the job. The rest of the job is ignition systems that a farmer can start on a cold morning, and parts on a shelf in a town he can reach, and a dealer who can service it, and a bank willing to lend against it, and a customer who has seen enough of the technology elsewhere to trust it in his own field. None of that existed in 1893. All of it existed by 1918. The company that Froelich started was in the right building, in the right town, with the right product, at the exact moment the money arrived. And he had been gone from it for 23 years. The distance between those two dates is the whole lesson. 25 years separates a machine that nobody could buy from a machine that a corporation would pay $2.33 million to own. Same idea, same layout, same town, in fact. The only variable that changed was when. Every company has a story like this. Subscribe if you would like the next one to find you.